finding all the things we knew were hiding. And this revelation only opens up more questions.
Hello everyone, welcome to From Nowhere to Nothing, Ontological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a graduate student in education at Liberty University. And with me is Mr. Norman Gayford, professor of English and philosophy at Genesee Community College. Norm and I have been waiting a long time for this episode. As a professional educator with decades of experience, Norm is intimately familiar with the educational system from practical, political, and nearly every other point of view. While I don't have any experience as an educator, I'm a passionate student with some conceptual knowledge of the education world. In fact, the only thing I'm more passionate about than education is philosophy. To repeat my mantra, everything is education and philosophy because each moment we learn and the next we make meaning. So strap in. All right, so yeah, this is a big topic, and I mean, I feel like we tease it all the time because of our two backgrounds. You know, whatever topic we're talking about, I think we're both thinking in the back of our minds about teaching it to students, or being taught, yep, or how we can apply some of these topics in ways that can help us enrich our lives. And I think that's a big aspect of what education should be about, if it's not completely in the current climate. And we'll get into some of that. First thing I'd like to say is, sorry we've been away so long. We did record an episode in the interim. Well, we thought we did. we ended up having some technical issues, and we lost it. But we'll go back to it as an episode on perspective, and in the future we'll re-record it. We'll revisit it again because it was an interesting topic. Yeah, it was. But we're back. I see that you guys have been listening right along, despite the absence of new episodes. We're up over 11,000 listens. So thanks for that.
Really?
Yeah, I meant to actually message you when we went over 1,000, and I forgot, and now we're over 1,100. Well, so I missed my opportunity.
1,100 is really well. Yeah, thanks for listening to us chat. I hope it is interesting.
Yeah. All right, so let's get into it. What is education? If you had to sum it up in one sentence, what would you say education is?
Tick. Education is the awakening and nurturing of independent thought and feeling and reflection about experience, with a foundational basis of knowledge to inform that reflection, period.
Very good. Nice. Okay, so that immediately brings up lots of different questions, right? So the first one I'll ask is, are education and learning inextricably intertwined? Are they a synonymous thing? How do you differentiate the two?
Well, you're taking me to... I mentioned John Dewey before we were talking before the show, but I'm not a Deweyist or a Deweyan. I'm not an anything. So I'm not subscribing to one theory or notion. I'm always eclectic. But education and learning, right, are not, to me, absolutely synonymous, because education sometimes refers to the system rather than what is taking place within the system. And sometimes a system can vertently or inadvertently get in the way of the learning. So I don't think they are the same thing. I think they imply different things. I think learning, it's kind of like morality and ethics. Morality is the smaller codified sets of principles that various people put forth as this is how we should behave. And ethics is that overarching umbrella of what is it that we do as human beings, and why do we decide that we should or shouldn't do it? All right, so the same thing for me is with education. Education is the overarching, learning is the overarching umbrella, and education is this little set of principles, that structure that we sometimes go by.
Gotcha. Okay, so one thing that you haven't said yet that I was curious if you were going to go to or not in discussing education and learning is the role of the teacher. So you hear people say that they should educate themselves, or self-educated or something. Do you think that that is actually a valid premise, or do you think that in any type of education there must be an outside mentor or influence or bestower or transfer of knowledge or guide, or what would you say about that?
Okay, I'm going to. I scribbled, I typed some things this morning that I really needed to bring. I didn't mention the teacher because you told me to talk in one sentence, not two. So, but I don't. When you said that phrase that we often hear, that the variations on that, you really teach yourself, right? I don't. I think we've all found in this pandemic situation, that which dates this podcast sometime if any people are listening to it later on, but that most students, in the sense of traditional students, is a sense of people, kids or young people or adolescents, young adults in school, do not, for the most part, like the idea of trying to teach themselves. And in fact, probably most of us don't. I mean, many of us will go to YouTube to try to figure out how to fix our John Deeres. And we go through that. Oh, that video wasn't helpful. Or this one is okay, but the camera angle was wrong. Or this one, but I can't hear them. Or this one was too fast. Wait, what was that? It doesn't show on the camera. And then you land on the one where it actually is helpful. The person is talking perhaps slowly, clearly. You can see the item that the person is talking about, where to place it. And so one is educating oneself, going through that process about what teaching is, without even realizing that you're learning about teaching by going through the. So I think a teacher or mentor is very necessary, not in the sense of telling you what to do all the time, but in trying to draw out your interest, or to spark it, or to nurture it. I often have thought of the metaphor of being in a chilly place, maybe winter. We're not talking about Call of the Wild yet, but and trying to get that fire started. And once you've got that little spark, you blow on it too hard, it's gone. And if you don't have dry tinder to help, then so you have to add things a little at a time. But when you make a fire, you don't stand there and say, "Whoa, look at that great fire I've made." Well, maybe some people do. Most of us don't. We say, "Thank God it's casting warmth." You don't say, "That's my fire." Usually, right? And the times in my teaching and Joel, you're one, when I say he's one of my best students, it's not that I made you that. It's that I recognize at all. It's that I recognize what you were made of, and your essential interest and ability to be lit on, tindered, and that's your doing. You did the learning. Your brother did the learning. So I've had thousands of students. It's such a blessing, and I couldn't claim any single one of them as, well, I made you a better student. No.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think what you're hitting on is something that is vastly overlooked in education, throughout the history of education, really until very, very recently, it's starting to gain some ground in mainstream education, which is that really, it's a symbiotic relationship. The teacher is not you can't look at them purely as the bestower of knowledge.
Right.
The teacher has to be a learner, and the learners have to be teachers. You have to learn what the students, what drives the students, what helps the students learn. And the students have to be able to express to the teacher what sort of things they struggle with, what sort of things they do well with, in order for actual learning to occur. Because that's the problem, is that your brain is just a jumble of neurons, very much like a viney plant. Like nobody has all the same connections all the same way. Everybody makes different connections different ways. They learn things different ways. And so an input, a stimulus of some kind, in this case, words on a page or sound on your ear or whatever, it's going to go through a different pathway for everybody, and how they learn and what it means to them is going to be different. Mm-hmm. And this isn't something that's just relevant for education. I use it in the business world a lot, where, and again, it comes down to a lot of platitudes and cliches, but appropriately applied, it really is something that is useful. Mm-hmm. Active listening.
Yes.
You have to sit and you have to actually not just hear the words somebody's saying, but decipher what they mean by what they're saying, and then figure out an appropriate course of action to do what's in the best interest for them and yourself and whatever enterprise it is that you're on.
And that's learning.
Right.
As much in the manufacturing as anywhere else, but this is where maybe I'm getting off track, and maybe we have more than one conversation about this. Maybe, but I think this is where education as that system starts to think too highly of itself, and people start looking at, as people are wont to do. What do? We look at what output happens. Mm-hmm. So rather than the process of manufacturing, and how do we make that process more organic and efficient and creative, right? Which we want to do. People are human. They want to be able to have a human workplace. We're not the 19th century anymore. But that 19th century idea of you're a cog, you do this, you stand here, you push this, no input. Well, that's the old model in some ways of education too. Have you ever read Parker Palmer?
Yeah.
Right. One of the most influential people to me, and one of my fellow teachers put me on to Parker Palmer, 20 years ago. And it's remarkable things. And what he says something that is right on track with what you're saying. Mentoring is a mutuality that requires more than meeting the right teacher. The teacher must meet the right student. And he talks about connectedness. And he talks about the idea of we have to figure out, as you said, the neurons and everything, the complex connections within ourselves, because our whole walk through life is making connections, having experiences, putting them into perspective. How do we do that with whatever reflection we manage to muster? And that's true in a classroom. That's true outside of a classroom. It's true in your zone, the manufacturing zone, as well as your zone in the classroom. You're not a teacher, but you're studying education. You are a teacher because you're doing a podcast. You're not a licensed teacher. When we look at that, okay, fine. I'm not a licensed contractor, and everybody's happy about that. but you don't always just get a certificate. It's so much about people getting certificates. Mm-hmm. It's like the Wizard of Oz to me. I can't help it, You go to the wizard in the movie version, at least, right? My wife's been reading The Wizard of Oz for people on the library chapters every week. So I'm back into Oz. But in the movie, what do you want? An education? Well, here, I give you a degree, and now you've got the brains, and suddenly the scarecrow can say, E equals MC squared or something. and a heart. I'll give you a heart. Well, here's a nice little ticking clock. It looks like a heart. that's what people think education is sometimes on the most superficial level. I sit there for a while, or I do this and I push that button and I do this, and ta-da, I get a certificate, which says that I can then go on and have a different job, as if it's all about jobs. And education is not all about jobs, and yet it's the very most foundational part of doing our work.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, it's a situation where language really betrays intention in a lot of cases. In the classes that I take, every class starts out with an introduction section where you answer a set of questions, and a couple of the questions are, what do you plan on getting a new job as a result of your degree? And there's only 4 or 5 questions, and that's one of them. So that tells you something about do you plan on getting a new job as a result of your degree? And that sort of thing. And really, once you get to the level that I'm at, I'm about to finish my master's degree. Everybody except me is going to school to get a job. There's nobody. So I'm really the oddball when I say, yeah, I'm just here to take classes for fun. Wait, what? And of course, it's very circumstantial as well. I'm provided a lot of valuable incentives due to prior military service and that sort of thing. So it wouldn't be possible for me to do that under regular circumstances, and that has to do with the funding aspect and of education, which, if we do get into it, I'm not sure if it'll be this episode. we are getting.
See, yeah, that's what I'm saying. I think we've got more.
It's a very complex. The entire issue is very complex. But yeah, no, I think, and that gets to the next distinction I'd like to make, which is, we talked about learning and education, right? I think that, learning is something that we're doing all the time. We're always learning. You're receiving stimulus and you're making assumptions about it. And sometimes your brain streamlines that process so it knows what's important to pay attention to and what's not. But you're always learning. But I think that education is a more structured process. Education requires, if not a mentor, at least some knowledge that is currently outside of your knowledge base. And it requires some sort of interaction, some sort of tools in order to obtain that knowledge.
Yes.
It's not something you can just kind of stumble upon the way you can learning something else.
Yes. The formality is there. You're right.
Right. So establishing that, my next question would be, how would you differentiate education and training? And that's one where in years past, maybe it would be a little bit simpler. Yeah. With current modern education, like we were just talking about, it might be a little bit trickier.
I think the assumption now, because it's been planted into people's minds, and it's just gone that direction. The assumption is already that almost all education is about training for in a very narrow sense, really, which is why my son and daughter-in-law deal with this as teachers all the time. What is art? What is music? They're called extras. Mm-hmm. Now, that may seem innocuous, but it's not an innocuous term. If you consider that extra means, we could do without those and still get an education. Well, that's utter nonsense, but that's where the current system is. So that's already a narrowing that's implied toward training, missing the boat that musical training or art training, as you said earlier, if just at the very one level, undergird the process of thinking by not being restricted into just the logical process. There's much logic in music. I've learned music enough to play a little bit on piano, right? I appreciate music. I'm not a music teacher. Same thing with art. I have an art teacher. I think I've become an artist. But the training aspects just focuses on what you're going to do when you grow up. What are you going to do when you leave? What does that certificate parlay into? And so training becomes almost a pejorative term. Training becomes a connotation of a little distasteful connotation, at least to me. Mm-hmm. And you can be trained to do anything if you have the right nascent skills. Not everybody can grow up and do anything in the world because we don't all have the skills to do such. But I think training has such a connotation of utility. And utility is narrowed in our circumstance to, 5 or 10 or 15 professions that you all want people to grow up and do.
Yeah. And I mean, really, if you get down to it, there's 4 of them that are really being pushed by the governance, and that's STEM. You have science, technology, engineering, mathematics, which are very important things. But no, going off of what you're saying, you can train a dog. Can you educate a dog? That's it. And so maybe that sort of gives you some insight, some insight into the difference. You can train fruit flies. You can. So I think that you're right. Training is. It is, again, I think that training falls under the umbrella of education. Training is a type of education.
Yes, it is.
It's a type of learning. But I think it's a type of learning that is, it's an exchange. And I think that's where that distastefulness comes in, is it's just, you get trained, we're going to provide you this training so that you can provide us this skill. Mm-hmm. And whereas education implies something different. We're going to provide you this knowledge, and you do with that knowledge what you see fit. Mm-hmm. Is, I believe, what education should be. Now, I think that it's narrowed much more recently to a definition that would be much more synonymous with training. They're saying, we're going to provide you this education, we're going to provide you this certification, and then you will provide us with this output in society. You'll be an engineer, you will be a teacher, whatever it'll be.
Right, it's transactional.
And as a result, they place different values on those certifications. So like you said, a music teacher, an art teacher is an extra because they don't perceive a music teacher or an art teacher as providing a valuable contribution to society. They're not providing an output that the governance sees as useful as an engineer or a scientist.
And yet, and see, this is where, because I don't want to, I'm in that frame of mind right now where I could very easily just get way too polar, and I fight this. I won't. So I'm going to counter myself. But there are school districts that even in the worst of times, the first people they lay off are the extras, or furlough, or whatever nice little euphemism we give, retrench. But some school districts say, no, we're keeping these, because I think there's a recognition, perhaps in parents. Collections of clusters of parents, perhaps in the people who are in charge, that there is something invaluable, but a lot of people have a hard time trying to articulate what's valuable about it because it's not an easily transactional process. You can't render everything into, well, you probably have encountered this too. One of the current crazes in the community college and that level of education is called micro-credentialing. Are you aware of this?
I have not heard that term.
Okay, it's a big deal. Micro-credentialing. People are stumbling all over themselves, institutions that try to provide this. So micro-credentialing would be, you come, you talk to our success coaches. We used to call them advisors, but you talk to our advisors, and we'll work out. You present a portfolio of your work, your vita, your resume, what you talk to us about. And an X institution will say, well, okay, I think we can give you 2 credits in engineering for this, or we can give you 1 credit in business writing, or whatever it happens to be. And we'll give you a little certificate that says, congratulations, you have earned 2 credits in engineering. And there's that little piece of paper, a little stamp on it, unique to each institution, but actually it's trying to be universalized now so that you can carry this like another kind of portfolio from one place to another, so that they can see, these are all the things that I can do. Now, there's a value in that, in the sense of, but only in the sense of the superficial layer of being validated by some authority, in the worst sense of authority, I think. Authority is important. We have lost the reference. I know I'm straying, but we've lost the appreciation for expert knowledge. Our culture is devastatingly off base with that now. And I think micro-credentialing could be a way of making that better, but it looks to me more like it's just becoming more coins. Here, have some. You're more valuable because you have these 3 pieces of paper. So it's emphasizing that. You can get your education done faster because you don't have to take this training because you've had 20 years of this. Therefore, there's nothing that we can teach you. It's essentially saying, we can't do anything for you because you're already way past us. In any good class, any reasonably good teacher would reject that notion outright and say there's always something more that you can learn, whether you had 20 or 30 or 40 or whatever year's number of experience in it. So
yeah, it's kind of a digitizing of credentialing, like it's finer resolution. You're taking that degree, and the biggest complaint that people have about that degree, oh, well, just because you have this degree doesn't mean you can do the job, or, even though I don't have the degree, I could do that job, and they're trying to ameliorate that. They're trying to say, oh, okay, well, maybe if you do have some background, you can do a part of this job, even if you don't have the whole degree.
This very semester at the beginning, it seems like an age. It's been a different world from where we started. There was, unnamed, an upper-level administrator. We'd gone through a whole workshop in micro-credentialing. And this person held this person's head at the end of the workshop and said, the only thing we have left to offer are credentials. And I was aghast. I was stunned because we'd been paired up, an unlikely pairing, by the leader of to brainstorm ideas. And I was aghast because, of course, we have so much more to offer. But if that's what this mindset puts people into, that it's just even a more shallowing and narrowing. Yeah,
it's the perspective thing again. It's like you said, even if you do a job for 50 years, right? Like this is a good example, right? I'm a musician, right? Let's say I've been a musician for 50 years, and then I decide to go to college for a music degree. I'm going to learn so many things because I taught myself how to play music. But even if I had music teachers in the past, how those people approached an instrument or music theory is going to be different from how a professional educator is going to do it. Mm-hmm. And the interactions between the students and between the teachers and the conversations that are had and the way things are played off each other are going to be completely different. So it's that humanity, it's that perspective, it's that interaction is what makes higher education special. But the very people who are running it no longer recognize it. And what it feels like to me is like a magnifying glass, right? You have the glass, and like the closer in, everything's blurry and upside down, and then the more you move the glass, and all of a sudden at some point it just flips and then everything's in focus. I feel like we're right before that point. Everything is upside down and jumbled and blurry and doesn't make any sense. And I feel like at some point, it's just going to click for people. This isn't what education is about. It's not just training. It's not just credentialing. There's something that has been going on in generations past that was useful and meaningful and not quantifiable in a output, in an output.
Yeah, I like your metaphor very much. We've gotten so well. You know this about me. In my first master's degree, I was one of the chompingest at the bit of behaviorism, which was really hitting its stride in the 1980s, early 1980s, late 70s, and that's where not all of my teacher training was going on, but it was underlying much of it. And that notion is just, as you say, magnified, although in a distorted sense. It's more like a hall of mirrors. So the notion that every single worthy thing that you can learn either can be measured, it's all empirical, or it doesn't exist in any meaningful way. And that's just so wrong. I mean, one of the things Parker Palmer says, good teaching cannot be reduced to technique. People, well, you can watch somebody teach. You can say, oh, okay, yeah, I might do that. You can hear good teachers, whatever metrics one uses to determine good teaching, because you can have two different teachers that you would not. You might learn equally from both of those teachers, but those two people wouldn't even talk to each other because of the way that they. So it's not technique. He says it comes from the identity and the integrity of the teacher, and the identity part comes from he says it's alien to academic culture. We have to talk to each other about our inner lives. We have to talk about risky stuff in a profession where no risk is often. In a system in which taking risks is often frowned upon, unless they have viable outcomes. Which, straying off again, is why we have such difficulty in our country, particularly with. We don't spend the money anymore on research and development in companies. Mm-hmm. It's primarily consider the stockholders, consider the enormous wealth of the paycheck of the CEO and so on. But the R&D budgets shrink. Why? Because any product we make, we've got to know that it's going to be successful. Well, that's not what R&D is about, and that's not what experimentation in the classroom is about. You're going to fail most of the time. You're going to try things out, and they're going to fall flat on their face, and the very fact of discussing with a student, why was that such a failure of a lesson, is where the real teaching takes place.
Right. Yeah, it reminds me of my own college experience at GCC, because in the same semester I had you and Mr. Allmeter as a history teacher, and very opposite teaching styles. Mr. Allmeter was he'd write 20 or 30 terms on a whiteboard at the beginning of the class, and then he would essentially just read through a book and through his notes, and each time he would say one of the words on the whiteboard, you'd have to take down the notes of whatever he said after that point. And halfway through the class, he'd erase the whiteboard and write up 30 more terms, And a lot of people hated him, because there were so many terms and there's so much note-taking and so much of this stuff. And I remember very clearly there was one student, Christine Titus, who was in every class I was in.
Oh, yeah.
And she was always just aghast because I'd walk into class and I always had a notebook and a pen, but I never opened them. And I would just sit them on the class, and I would just sit there, and I would listen. And I would listen to the entire thing. And he talked chronologically, so he's going through the history. Mm-hmm. So I'm just listening to the story of American history from the Revolution to the Civil War. or from the Civil War to modern times, or world history from here to here. And I'm just imagining the story. I'm trying to picture the characters. I'm trying to picture the events. Imagine why a general would decide to make this sort of flanking maneuver in this situation as opposed to just holding tight, or whatever the case is, And he would give weekly quizzes, and, I would routinely get A's on quizzes, and all the other students were struggling, and they had notebooks full of notes, And what it came down to is you and Mr. Almeida obviously had super different teaching styles, but I think that you were both good teachers. And he would stop mid-class and he would share stories. He would talk about things that had, were important were germane to the history lesson or to our lives and things. And, years later, I didn't see him for, probably 10 years, and I saw him later and he remembered me, and we talked and stuff. And again, it's that connection, and it's about the learner as much as it is the teacher. It's about how the teacher feels about their subject matter just as much as what sort of approaches they use. There's a lot of different things that come across, and it's more about than just, did you spend this amount of time in the class? Did you answer this number of questions right? Because even though he used some of those methods. Okay, well, I'm going to do 60 terms, and we're going to do a 10-question quiz each week.
Yeah.
He still took the time to passionately tell the story. He still had essays and papers and things that he would critique on the knowledge that you put into it, as opposed to just the structure or the format or the precision and stuff. And really, it says a lot about what education should be. It can be a wide variety of things. It doesn't have to fall into this, okay, well, you spent 60 credit hours in this class and you answered this number of multiple choice questions right, so here's your credential, and you never really have to think about anything that you learned here again. Just go and do a job, and they'll actually teach you all the thing you need to know when you get there. Those things had a lifelong impact on me, and history, history is something that students are forced to take,
and it's one of the most fascinating
even
things.
though it's not essential to jobs or whatever.
Right.
I use that. I use a lot of that stuff that I learned, and
because you treat it. This is what we were talking about also before the podcast, because of the nature of story, and this is where I think one of the nexus points for all knowledge. All knowledge ultimately is anchored in story, and how the stories are told, how the stories invite you in or kick you out. The history, well, sure, but for the longest time, huge segments of our population were not invited into the story that was the essence of the lives of that population, rendered through imperial tales of privilege and triumph, rather than the human stories. And this is where history is really, for me, very fascinating, when you actually get into the human stories and say, yep, there's every reason to say we came to this continent and we lay waste civilizations, and we pat ourselves on the back for it, and we toss a coin to those civilizations, or a thought, maybe once in a while. And of course, it's more complicated than that, because of course we've accomplished all kinds of things, but we cannot and must not forget what was done and what continues to be done in order to maintain that system, because education is also about maintaining systems.
Yeah, and that's a good example of education versus training. Is that, why would you take history? To be a history teacher. So if you look at history teaching as training, you take this series of courses, you learn a series of facts, the dates that the War of 1812 took place between and whatnot. You get your credential, and then you regurgitate all of those facts that you learned for other students, and There you go. That's the propagation of society. But that's not education. Education is listening to that story and then weaving other stories from other sources,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
Because for the longest time, history, as taught in the United States, didn't tell the stories of large groups of people.
No.
Or it distorted the stories of large groups of people. And that distortion, I believe, is something that is primarily responsible for many of the racial and gender issues that we're having in society now. People have been habituated through the single perspective story that they were told in school to believing that things took place in a certain way. My brother sent me a funny meme the other day that there's the first panel, the character says, the character is labeled American history. And he says, I've never done anything wrong in my life. And then the second panel shows another character and it's labeled the American people and it says, that's why I love you. You know? And it's true. If you take what you've been taught in history class and you just accept it on face value and you just accept those facts and regurgitate those facts, you would be under the impression that, America is full of steely-eyed patriots who were always, somehow never made a mistake.
Yep.
And it's simply not true. And, all the way from huge faux pas and mistakes of the founding fathers down to just nuanced things of what perspective things are shared from. So really what education is it's giving you the perspective and the intellectual tools to look at things from a multidisciplinary way, from different facets, putting yourself in other people's shoes, and being able to develop new narratives and integrate new knowledge and follow these sorts of things. And history is a really good example of that.
Yes.
And that goes to show, with some of the racial and the gender problems that you're having, sometimes you wonder, how can these people on one side or the other, but specifically the more conservative side, how can somebody just take this, and how can they not see that this is wrong? But when you look at it the way that we've talked about, and you look at how they've been educated,
Yeah.
and from what perspective they've been educated, and what kind of reflection they've put into the things that they've been told, it's suddenly not as mysterious anymore why they think the way they do.
And that you're right. And that last one, that R word particularly, reflection leads sometimes to epiphanies. Not always. That's why an epiphany is special. Reflection leads to fresh thought and fresh realization. Reflection also leads to humility. That's when I think I know if someone has become or is already truly a student. I mean, I've had, even this semester, when I tell people I'm just as much a student as you are, and there's some of the, you are not, you're the teacher. You can't say you're a student because, but I am. How could I not be? And I know less now than I did when I started, because I know so much more. But that means there's so many more things to question and to wonder about that there's no way. So it's very Socratic. But of course, but that, and it sounds goofy to sit and say, well, it's about humility, because it sounds like you're not being humble, and that's not what it's about. The humility of realizing there are so many things one doesn't know, and one shouldn't be so blasted sure of everything. The more one finds out about how things have been. And all of that should counter this deadening polarization that we have. It should, if we were really an educated people, we wouldn't be in this position. That's not to say we'd all agree with each other. Of course we wouldn't. We'd be actually engaging in conversations that were not shouting matches. We would actually be encountering and working at ideas and trying to figure out. But that would be a truly educated people. And we, sadly, I think, are not yet. But we have the capacity of being.
Yeah. No, I understand exactly what you're saying. And it's again, it comes back to kind of what I was getting at, is that when it's a systemic problem with the education system has been so focused on accountabilities and outcomes for so long that it's become a zero-sum game where you either pass or you fail. You are either right or you're wrong. And as we all know, that's not the way real learning works. Your example earlier of the contractor was a good example, right? Your lawnmower breaks. You go on YouTube. You find the first video. The video doesn't work out. So, maybe you failed because you didn't have enough information. He didn't use the right camera angles, so you didn't know what bolt he was loosening, so you loosened the wrong bolt. Okay, you failed. So what do? You tighten up that bolt. You find a different video with the right camera angle. But maybe he's using terms that you don't understand, so that one doesn't work either. So you fail again. So you find a different video. Because eventually you don't have any choice but to fix your lawnmower. You can't just leave it broken. So you fail multiple times. But you don't think of it as failing the same way you think of getting an F on a test, right? You
That's
don't
right.
think
That's
of it
right. Yeah.
the same way as failing.
Because it's hands-on.
Right. And it's the same thing with any other number of real life learning. If I'm writing a song and I'm trying to find a chord progression, I play a chord that doesn't work. Even more than that, if I play a chord and I'm thinking this does work, and then I write the song, and then 3 hours later I go, this chord isn't working, Well, I failed. But do I just throw out the entire song at that point? Maybe sometimes I do. Maybe sometimes I modify it. Either way, it's a failure because what I did originally did not work. But the fact of the matter is that failure doesn't have long-lasting implications for my life other than that it taught me something. Yeah. It taught me this chord doesn't transition into this chord with this melody line in this scenario. Maybe down the road I can make it fit, right? But so I'm either discarding this song was a failure, and I'll write new songs, whatever, it's not a big deal. Or the chord didn't work, so I'll replace it with another chord, and I'll make the song work. Yeah. So it was a temporary failure, and either way you look at it, it's a temporary failure, it's a temporary setback, and then you learn something and you move on. And I feel like that's what role failure in education should be playing. It should be a pruning of the tree. You grew in a direction that wasn't towards the sun. So you clip those branches and then you let the thing grow in a more productive fashion. It shouldn't be cutting down the tree.
Very nice. Or determining, this tree is not valuable.
Right.
Or this tree is more valuable than this tree. So we'll give this tree more attention and okay.
Right. Yeah. And so I think that's what's led to a lot of the societal problems that we've had is you have these people who are either liberal or conservative or, pick whatever side. Any topic you pick is going to be controversial and divisive because we've made it that way, because people have an ingrained, a socially ingrained perception that if they're wrong, that's it. That's the end. And it's not that way. And what makes education humbling, like you said, it's not false humility. What it's saying is that I'm the teacher. I've gone through years of learning about something, but I'm just as capable of learning about this topic of which I'm a master from somebody who's never encountered it before. I'm just as capable of learning something from them as they are from learning about me.
That's right, because you ask a question that I haven't heard asked before, or in the way that you ask, or you say, oh, this makes me think of, and I never, or this happened in my life, and it sort of reminds me about what I read in this essay, and suddenly it's all fresh again. Right? Or you come back to a book that you haven't read in some time, and it's a brand new book to you, not because you don't remember elements of it, but because your now voice in your mind, taking it all in, is not the same. That's why I read Lord of the Rings once every 10 years, at least. Sometimes lately it's been a little bit more than that. This is because, when at a certain point in your life, maybe you feel like a hobbit. Sometimes maybe you start to feel like Strider or Aragorn, right? And then you realize, that Gandalf is closer to it. and so you see the viewpoint of the story through a character that you didn't inhabit before, and it tells you fresh things. And any book, a worthy book, can do that. Mm-hmm. Any worthy song can. If you listen to a song that you have written, listen to any piece of music, which is totally bound up in your emotional state at that moment, the experiences that you've had, the associations you make with it, the memories, and so it's bound to be fresh. Education is bound to be fresh if we approach it in that way as teachers, as vulnerable, as I have things to offer you, but you have things to offer in return, and between the two of us, or the 30 of us, we're going to come to some fresh knowledge. Mm-hmm. And it may not parlay into X cents per hour in whatever work you do, because you're not going to be able to measure that. You don't know.
Right.
But it may change the course of your life. It may change what you think about, how you approach a problem.
Yeah, and that's the big problem with it, right? Is that education has become increasingly focused on accountability and bureaucratic managerialism, and this quantification of outputs. But as you just said, reading Lord of the Rings, each time you're identifying with a different character, each time you come back to that same thing, you're a different person. Yeah. And so as a result, it's almost like trying to quantify a quantum system. Like you're trying to, what education's trying to do is say, Schrodinger's cat is alive, and you can't, every time a student walks into the classroom, they're different. They have a different skill set. They have a different emotional state. They have a different relation to the topic. Mm-hmm. And what they take away from it is going to be different. And so that's not to say that there isn't essential skills students should learn.
Oh, sure there are.
And essential understandings of a topic they should come away from after a course of study.
That's the foundational knowledge.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But it just highlights the fact that there's more to it than that. There's more to it than what you can quantify at the end. Mm-hmm. And I think of myself as a pretty good example of that. Every class I've ever taken, I feel like I've gotten so much out of it. I feel like I've learned so many things. And how have I applied them? When I look at where I'm at in my career, or, the subjects that I have degrees in, criminal justice, psychology, education, interdisciplinary studies. Well, how have I used them as an output for society? How have I contributed to society with them? I haven't. I haven't done anything with them in a monetary sense, in a way that the government would pat me on the back for, you're doing a good job contributing to society. No, I haven't done that, but I've taken away so much from them personally. Every single class I've taken, I've had good teachers and bad teachers, and good materials and bad materials, and all run the gamut. But there's always a lesson to learn from each one of them,
yes.
And how you integrate that with the other things that you've learned, and the fulfillment it provides, the perspective it provides, and how it enables you to learn new material going forward is an unquantifiable, but in
experientially, priceless,
priceless feeling.
That's so well said. Okay.
So I feel like we've really done a good job looking at education philosophically. I know what we were thinking we were going to do was cover education philosophically at the beginning, then dive into the societal and political kind of interactions of education, which we did do in a fringe sort of way. But I think that there's definitely a lot more worth talking about. There's huge philosophical battles being waged in the political and societal arena. They'll probably be worth talking about in an entirely other episode.
Yeah, we could do a whole episode just on the technology of teaching.
Yeah. So we'll get into that maybe next time, maybe down the road a little bit. But it was really fun just talking about the fundamentals of education.
It was.
All right, everyone. Thanks for listening. Until next time, keep pondering.